I think we can probably make a start, seeing as we're running a bit behind anyway. So yeah, thank you everyone for joining us. It's really good to see you all. It's been a little while since we had the last one of these. The last one was in early September, which was the day after the inauguration of the all-party parliamentary group, the APPG for Fair Elections. The inauguration as opposed to a public launch. We'll be talking about the public launch, which happened just last week today. But it was also before conference, so we're going to give a bit of an update on everything that's happened since our last meeting, our conference events, and then a lot of what's happened in Parliament. It's been as I say, a very busy few months of the start of this Parliament. I mean, we've been saying, I think, certainly since the start of the year, and then even more intensely since the general elections, that this next phase of the campaign really is going to be a lot more about what happens inside Parliament than it has been for most of the last parliamentary term, where it was all about grassroots, building power within the labour movement and trade unions. So a lot of the action has moved to Parliament, and we're going to be getting an update on that. But I do just want to say thank you, everyone, very much for the work that all of you did in the last Parliament to get us to this stage, because everything we're going to be talking about today is really only happening because of the work that all of you have done and many other people besides. I know that's a bit of a cliche for campaigns and organisations to say, like, we can't do this without you, but this really has been directly the result of all the work that people have done in the last Parliament from this call. Okay, so we're going to jump in, and I mean, we'll talk about conference, we'll talk about the APPG launch, and then we'll talk about the big vote that took place yesterday and a few other bits, and then we'll just have a bit of a discussion. We've got some photos and a couple of slides and a couple of videos to show along the way. So we'll see how we get on. But firstly, I mean, the first thing to talk about is conference, which came pretty shortly after the last one of these calls. This year's conference, as we've been explaining, is sort of different from most of the recent party conferences we've had. There wasn't a big motion, there wasn't a big sort of yes/no vote to be won. The real objective of it was to demonstrate that there's that continued support as we get into this new parliamentary term, and that PR remains a really big priority across the membership and across the wider Labour movement and senior figures as well. And I mean, the really key intervention at conference was the fringe event that we organised, at which we had Andy Burnham speaking. We had Anna Dixon, who's a new Labour MP, Professor Rob Ford, who's a long-standing friend of campaign from Manchester University, and our own Caroline Osborne. It was a really sort of packed, large hall inside the conference centre, and you know, there's sort of standard, really visible presence across conference. So that's just really important for showing that that pressure is still there and that demand for electoral reform is still there across the party. It was quite an interesting fringe event, not least because Andy Burnham used the occasion to call on the government to launch, it was somewhat vague, but launch some sort of review into the first past the post. The thinking being, we had this, you know, policy before the election, that first past the post is driving distrust and alienation in politics. We had the election result, which, you know, in many senses, obviously it's great to have a Labour government, but in many senses underlines that distrust and alienation with such an unrepresentative outcome. So what has to be done? Something has to be done about it. And Andy Burnham called for a review. I'm just going to show a short video. Now, apologies for the sound quality on this, because the room we're in had pretty terrible acoustics. And that really has come through on the video, but we have subtitles, so we'll see how it goes.
Obviously, a lot of this time, but I think what we have to discusses isn't the right system for the future. There are principled and pragmatic reasons why Labour has been fixated on being favour of in recent years. So our system cannot cope with multiple parties. It's a two-party system and it doesn't work. We need people to see politics as a force for good. Labour knows that first past the post is fueling this distrust. So we really have to address that too.
Why not launch a review of the voting system for the House of Commons, and why not consider carefully whether proportional representation has the support of the country?
The strategic argument is it is in Labour's interests to embrace a discussion of electoral reform now that we manage to spend 5 years down the line.
Okay, so yeah, that's a kind of flavour of what was said at the event, and that picked up some good press coverage. Just having that sort of senior intervention from, I mean, someone who is now a well-known advocate of PR within the Labour movement, but a very sort of headline-grabbing advocate at that. Also at Labour conference, I mean, we had full presence. We had a stall which was staffed by Labour Campaign for Electoral Reform, Sandy and John, I can see on the screen. We had lots and lots of networking opportunities, which Alex was, as our parliamentary organizer, was taking full advantage of. It's just a really good opportunity to get out and talk to MPs, and doing that real intensive sort of relationship building and networking is just really key in this new phase as a campaign. So that's conference. I'm going to skip ahead a bit to what happened basically last week, which was the launch of the All-Party Parliamentary Group, the public launch, and the launch of its report. This was a long time in the planning. Reports can be a bit of a pain to do as a campaign organisation, and they're really important to do, but you always got to make sure they have very specific strategic reasons. And this one, which was done by Fair Vote, the secretariat of the All-Party Parliamentary Group, I think had those very specific strategic reasons. So the All-Party Parliamentary Group is focused not just on proportional representation, that's one of its 3 objectives, but it also focuses on getting dark money out of politics and combating disinformation in election debates. And these 3 sort of threats are really sort of seen as 3 versions of the same problem, that people have different amounts of say in our elections, in our democratic contests. And I think it's really been borne out, the approach of bringing together those 3 things with lots of recent events in the US and the UK that have happened in recent months. The report itself, I'm going to show a few slides on this, is, as you might expect, split into 3 sections dealing with first past the post, dark money and disinformation. The report's called Free But Not Fair. And the first section, I mean, on first past the post, we really cover, so the reason I'm saying we is because I also work partly at Fair Vote. So for me, it's sort of both a matter of wearing both hats. But the first past the post section, we'll share the report in a chat, but there's sort of a pretty thorough analysis of what the impact of the electoral system was on the 2024 general election, which, as we know, was the most distorted election in British history. You know, lots of really striking stats in terms of number of votes you need per MP and so on. But I think the really interesting aspect of it is it goes more into the long-term trends about how first past the post is getting worse and worse, and the problems with it are becoming more and more aggravated. I would recommend having a look at it if you have a moment. Things like the fact that turnout has just been on a consistently falling line. The vote for the biggest 2 parties has been falling and is now at its lowest point in a century. And perhaps most sort of worryingly, the share of the vote you need to win a majority has just fallen off a cliff and is now at the lowest it has ever been. And that means any party can win under that with that sort of vote share. To have a look through this, this is, I think, one of the most interesting bits of First Past the Post, which is sort of setting out the consensus about needing change. On the left, we have support for changing the system over time, according to the public. Again, really striking that, you know, the status quo has just turned around, and we're now at this record of majority support for the last 10 years or so. And on the right, we have, on the bottom right, we commissioned polling which basically asked whether people think the flaws that Labour's identified in the voting system need to be addressed before or after the next general election. And 2/3 of people said it needs to be addressed before the next general election. There's one recommendation in the report for each of the 3 threats. The one for electoral reform is setting up a national commission for electoral reform. And this is seen as a really sort of independent, representative process. It should involve citizens, it should involve experts, and it's really a matter of evaluating all the options, looking at the experience of other countries and recommending what the best system would be for the UK. And for that to happen quickly, it should be set up next year. There's a couple of recommendations on the other so the other threats as well. I'll leave you to have a look through the report to find out more about those. And I think I'm going to hand over to Alex to talk a bit about the launch event and membership of the APPG.
Thanks, Joe. So that kind of gives you a bit of a flavour of what we were asking for at the APPG launch and what the report was. For those unfamiliar with what APPGs are, they are just basically groups that parliamentarians can join. And what makes this one particularly unusual is how big we've managed to make it already. Typically, APPGs used to have maybe 12 members in the old Parliament. The rules have changed around them to make them much more strict about how many members you need. You need at least 20 members now, which has meant a lot of APPGs are much harder to form. We easily reached that bar and have gone on to continue recruiting. So we've got 110 members in this APPG now, and most importantly, most of them are Labour MPs. That was something that we're really keen to ensure when we were setting it up, that it didn't just become a kind of repository for parties and MPs that their party policy is very clearly in favour of PR. So that's a really good base upon which to build, and really strengthens all of those campaign asks that Joe is talking about. And of those 55 and growing Labour MPs, they're from all traditions in the party as well, so it's a very unifying place for Labour MPs to get involved with and carry the campaign forward. I've also got some slides here of the event last Monday, which I'll share with you. Hoping everyone can see that okay. So we had a really good lineup of speakers at the event. We had the APP's chair, Alex Sobel, who's a Labour MP, as many of you will know. We had Ellie Chowns from the Greens in the bottom left there, Lisa Smart from the Liberal Democrats, who are 2 of our vice chairs. We had Emma Best as well, who's the deputy leader of the Conservatives in the London Assembly, who's just in the yellow jumper. And she presented a really compelling case for why Conservatives should come on board for supporting electoral reform, which for a long time has been a kind of missing part of the puzzle. And we also had the broadcaster Gavin Esler and Mark Drakeford, who, as many of you will know, has been a staunch supporter of this stuff for a long time. The APPG also launched with endorsements from Amber Rudd and Rory Stewart, which really helps kind of widen the spectrum of political support and make the case that this isn't a fringe issue. This is something that has support right across the political spectrum now. And there'll be some familiar faces in this crowd. I know some of you will have been there. in the bottom left here, we've got the Labour MPs that managed to make it. There was a whipped vote on at the same time, which many of them had to rush off to make, and there were several other receptions on at the same time. So it's really great that we had as many turn up as we did. And we also had a lot of the cross-party campaigns and sister campaign LCER there as well. I think everyone really enjoyed it. It was really great as well to see kind of allied campaigns and increasing amounts of young people turning up. I know Make Votes Matter have got a kind of youth wing that they're building, and Young Labour turned up as well. So it's really great to see young people getting like enthusiastic about electoral reform, and it kind of signals that this is the direction that the future of democracy needs to take. And I'll stop sharing there. I think that just about covers it. I think you might have a video, right, Joe?
Yeah, I'm just going to show a video of Mark Drakeford speaking. And just to say, while I'm sorting out the sound on this, although that looks like a handful of Labour MPs, I mean, it is a large handful of Labour MPs. That is a really good turnout for any parliamentary event. You're very unlikely to get sort of 150 Labour MPs in the room for an all-party parliamentary group. If you get sort of 3, you're doing pretty well, and if you get a decent handful, then it's really a big endorsement, and it's just the tip of the iceberg for the number who are supporting it. Okay, let's see what Mark Drakeford has to say.
So there is a great deal to be troubled about in our current system, and yet from the outside, and I've only ever been an outsider to Westminster, it does always seem to me to have been seized of a very mighty dread, both of political reform, but also the consequences of it. As you've heard, 3 of the 4 nations of the United Kingdom have for more than a quarter of a century had proportional forms of election, and have managed not just to survive that, but to thrive under it as well. The report that you have in front of you tonight sets out a really important prospectus for the reform of politics here. It will require a degree of political courage. It will require a dose of democratic humility, because the current system doesn't work and has to be recognised as such. But more than anything else, I just wanted to congratulate all 109 members of the APPG. To make change happen, you have to organise. You have to be prepared to make those arguments. You have to be prepared to do the long, hard things of making change happen. That's why an APPG of this sort is so important, and that's why tonight is a really important milestone on that journey. Diolch yn fawr. Thank you very much.
Such a good speaker, Mark Drakeford. And it was great to have him there along with all our other speakers. Really good event. We got some great press coverage around it. There was exclusive coverage in The Guardian on the morning of the APPG launch. And I think we had 4 different op-eds by people who are speaking, which went out in different publications. And then there was just a lot of sort of coverage coming off the back of that. So I think really quite an important intervention. Lots of the coverage, very clearly focused around the first past the post ask, which I think is sort of, well, probably in the view of our campaign, the most important, certainly, but I think also perhaps the most sort of striking when it comes to media attention. So really, really positive. Skipping ahead, hot off the back of that, we went into this week with a 10-minute rule bill, or 10-minute rule motion, being put forward by the Liberal Democrat MP Sarah Oldney. And this basically is a mechanism, if you're not familiar with parliamentary procedure, is a mechanism by which MPs can traditionally sort of draw attention to and raise an important issue. It usually gets a kind of prime time slot in the Commons. The MP will be selected by ballots. You enter a raffle to see if you get to do a 10-minute rule bill. And the person who is given this slot straight after either PMQs or some other, departmental question session. And they get the opportunity to speak for 10 minutes, making the case to introduce a bill on any subject of their choosing. It's been done in the past on PR. In fact, Jonathan Reynolds, who's a long-time supporter of electoral reform, did a 10-minute rule bill to introduce PR just under 10 years ago, I think. But on this occasion, it was done by Sarah Olney, and it went down in a very different way because of the change that there has been in the makeup of Parliament and in the support amongst particularly the Labour benches and Parliament as a whole. So the result, well, Sarah spoke for 10 minutes. There was then a very sort of lackluster response from a Conservative MP whose name I haven't even written down. But you can check out the full debate. We'll put the link in the chat. It's worth watching the bill being moved because it is a very good speech. And it's worth watching the response because it's interesting to see what the Conservatives come back with and how, frankly, lackluster it is. Now, at the vote, we had basically done everything we could to get MPs along to support the bill. It became clear that there was going to be a free vote for backbenchers on the day itself. We didn't necessarily expect that to happen, but on discovering that's the case, then it's quickly pretty apparent that there's a big opportunity here. So we reached out as broadly as possible, and I know other groups in other parties or cross-party did the same. And the result was a historic win. For the first time, the House of Commons has voted in favour of introducing proportional representation for the British general elections and local elections in England. The vote was 138 in favour against 136 opposed, and 59 Labour MPs, all of them backbenchers, voted in favour. Now, this is a huge moment in many ways. It's a really big symbolic win. These bills do not become law as a rule. They draw on a very long sort of queue of backbench bills, which may, someday get a bit of consideration. But in general, you wouldn't expect this to proceed to.
I'm just on a Zoom call at the moment.
But nonetheless, it was a huge moment and attracted a great deal of attention from the press. There's been headlines which we've, frankly, on top of the APPG stuff, have sort of struggled to keep up with this week, and it's really quite a significant moment. We can talk a bit about what happens next, but have I missed anything on that, Laura or Alex? Do you want to?
I think it's probably just worth mentioning, like, this 10-minute rule bill was sort of at the drop of a hat whether or not MPs would vote for it. It wasn't like a big campaign push, weeks or months in the making. It was a litmus test on what is the mood of this new Parliament, and the whips made it an open vote. We got wind of it, and then we got in touch with MPs that we knew were supportive. Often people don't even turn up for these votes. You'll see, like, the turnout for 10-minute rule bills as a whole is generally fairly low, unless it's something like assisted dying. So it's remarkable that as many people turned out as they did. If you look at the other votes on PR previously, they're not as well attended as this one, and that it went in our favour. As Joe says, it sets a new kind of bar for support. It's kind of been left to be pushed and been found to be solid in its support. So, and all of that, despite the fact that it's a Lib Dem 10-minute rule bill, which, if you're kind of tribal, and many of us are in Labour, you might not be minded to support it. Despite that, many people saw the merit in supporting the bill on its own terms. So it's really great that we've got that base of support, and I think we are in a pretty strong position from there to make the case that this shouldn't be something that's ignored or can be afforded to be kicked down the road anymore, and that a national commission is the way to bring the country and the Labour Party together around this.
Yeah, and we've had a article in Labour List just this afternoon, which I'll put in the chat as well. But I mean, just reinforcing what Alex said there, and also, you know, this is another case where the support for electoral reform that you see on the floor from Labour, although it is like substantial and historic in this case, is really quite strongly understated by various things. I mean, partly, as Alex said, the fact that it's an opposition motion, which, you know, it's, might be seen as sort of causing trouble or whatnot. But significantly, because although it was a open vote for backbenchers, none of the front benchers were able to vote. You know, even people who are parliamentary private secretaries and things like that, and there's a lot of them. So there's a lot of support there. This is another case where it's sort of indicative of a much wider groundswell of support.
Yeah, I just perhaps, if I can, Joe, chip in very, very briefly, and wanted to just pick up on a point that Sandy has made in the chat. A couple of people have said, my MP is in favour of PR, but they voted against. And I kind of want to endorse what Sandy has said, really, which is that if you are really in favour of PR and for whatever reason you think you can't vote for the bill, then you should stay away. I think one of the challenges of this coming so early in the Parliament is probably that in one case at least, and I don't think we should go into details, but Alex is following up with everyone. In one case, I think we had someone who genuinely was a bit confused about what was going on. In another case, we had somebody who wasn't minded to back it because they felt that the process was inadequate, that there should have been a longer debate and so on. So, you know, I think those are probably good faith, if slightly misguided, reasons for not voting for. There's at least another person who's been a previously quite high profile pro-PR person who voted against for reasons unbeknown to the rest of us. But I think one of the challenges is literally around the tactics. And at this stage of Parliament, some people simply don't yet get it. So I hope that answered the questions that at least a couple of you had made, but Sandy's put an answer in the chat as well, which I kind of refer you all to. And I think final thought is that we were uncertain about whether or not this was a good move, I think, as Joe mentioned, and this points to the need for us to have a really tight parliamentary strategy, which is now going to be very much the focus of the next few weeks and indeed months, because this worked really well, which is brilliant. And Joe's article is really sets out extremely clearly how, in fact, this underrepresents the level of support in Parliament. But we also know that every time you win, your detractors wake up a bit. And so we cannot expect to have it necessarily quite so easy next time. So we have to be very careful about when next time is. So we are obviously talking to people from other parties and no parties to make sure that we don't get an unwanted sort of flurry of questions at inopportune moments, because this campaign's great success, and again, thanks to all of you, we've only ever gone forward. Occasionally, we've not gone as far forward as we would have liked. So obviously, we'd have liked an all singing, all dancing commitment to PR in the manifesto, but we did secure something in the policy programme. We've now gone forward again in Parliament, and we need to now stay where we are. So we're going to be working with others to just make sure that we don't get the wrong question at the wrong moment, which ups the ante at a point which we're not ready for, because I think we now know that the whips will really be paying attention, which is why our call for a commission, which sort of takes the sting out of this a bit and allows everybody to have a broader debate, we think is a really smart move, so we can continue to expose bit by bit the support that there is in Parliament. And then eventually, of course, there will be another moment like the one that we had this week. I hope that makes sense. Obviously, we can talk a bit more about parliamentary strategy later.
I think we've just got a couple of bits to tie up, and then we'll come to you both, Sandy and Brenda. But Alex, do you want to just talk about some of the other things that happened in Parliament quickly?
Yeah, so it's probably also mentioning, like, there's been a huge wave of new MPs come in. Like most of the PLP is new Labour MPs, and in their maiden speeches and in a few kind of other interventions, we've had some really good early signs of support for PR, or for, you know, winking at democratic reform where we know someone is an ironed-on supporter. So we've had people like Tim Roker, Andrew Ranger, Kat Smith, Abdissam Mohammed, Scott Arthur. The list goes on. There's a whole kind of array of long-standing MPs, and particularly the new intake, who have expressed support and just kind of kept this on the agenda, just making sure that it's there, it's not going away, it's always kind of getting a bit of a look in. We should probably also address Angie Ranger. I don't know, Joe, if you want to go into that, but
I think that falls to Laura.
Okay.
A couple of people have mentioned in the chat care at PMQs, which we wanted to just briefly talk about, and before that, Angie. So Angie was asked a question by a Lib Dem about did she support a national commission, and to give her credit, she gave an extremely succinct for a politician answer, because she just said no. Then you'll have seen, some of you, that at PMQs today, Keir was also asked a question about effectively the follow-up to this bill, and I'm just going to find his exact answer for that. I can't remember it, I'm afraid, but we have got it written down somewhere for those of you who didn't watch this exchange. Keir was, have you got it there, Joe?
Yeah, his exact answer was proportional representation is not our policy. We won't be making time for it. And by that, he was referring to parliamentary time for the private members bill, which was the question asked. And then he said, and I just gently say he, meaning Ed Davey, didn't do too badly under the system as it is.
Yeah, so thank you, Joe. As someone has said in the chat, I think it was Ivan or Ivan, that's a pretty dismissive response. And I think it is a pretty dismissive response, but that tells us probably quite a bit. I mean, first of all, of course, as we all know, Labour does have official policy recognising that the current system doesn't work. We've not yet got the all singing, all dancing pro PR policy, but we are much further advanced on this than Keir was trying to suggest. And he has said numerous times that restoring trust in politics is a key priority. So it's simply not sustainable for those two positions to be held. You know, you can't say the electoral system seeds alienation and distrust and that you don't want to do anything about it. I think the fact that Keir was unable to then actually defend in any way the current system or really criticise PR, and didn't try to do either, whilst first reading you might think it's a bit frustrating. I agree that it was a kind of dismissive reply. That's the gap where our hope and our campaign is, because as we've discussed a bit before, when Keir wants to make a very sort of authoritative statement, he can be really quite dogmatic. So you'll remember when he was asked about the EU, he said, no, we will never rejoin the EU. Well, never seems like a very long time away. And that's a pretty sort of, I brook absolutely no alternative position. He's been sort of similarly assertive on a number of other things. So he didn't do that. And it's clear that that's because he doesn't want to do it. So although, yes, it is frustrating, we would agree. And yes, we'd like a different answer. I mean, I probably wouldn't have put the question to him today, because I think that is the answer that we're going to get for the moment. But essentially, all we've really heard from him is that there's no plan to take forward an opposition bill. Well, that's no big surprise. And he's not really willing to enter into the argument. So that is all good news, because that's the space where we then campaign. I hope that makes sense as an answer, and that it addressed the points made in the chat. Yeah,
and this is really good. I mean, it's good that there is pressure on a scale that there really hasn't been, for a lot of time. I think, in the run up to the 2022 conference, or perhaps a bit in 2023, there was a period when basically any time Keir did an interview, and often when Labour spokespeople did interviews, they were asked about electoral reform. And I think we're entering that sort of territory now. So it's really good that the pressure is on, and we just need a really smart, effective strategy for turning it up. But by Christmas, we're going to have a officers meeting of the APPG to sort of talk through strategy for next year. Alex is going to be continuing really thoroughly, just reaching out to all Labour MPs, which he's always doing, but in the wake of the vote, particularly those who supported and those who perhaps disappointed, and just continuing that really intensive work. And then in the new year, we'll be, I'm sure, followed with a full APPG meeting, likely in January, and really kickstarting what will be a proper parliamentary campaign, to build pressure. And that is a way that this sort of change has happened in the past. These kind of campaigns have found success. So I hope that's clear. We've gone pretty long.